In this video, I'm going to cover how I scored in the 100th percentile, so in the 280s, on my Step 2 exam as a USMLE student, and provide you with tips and recommendations based upon that. I'll cover my approach to studying, the resources I used, my take on Anki, how I studied from questions, and so on. In the future, I will make a second video walking you through how I answered the NBME questions as well. These videos are just me trying to pay it forward because I personally thought it was helpful when people did write-ups after their exams before. Now, really importantly, whatever I say is just one person's take. This is not gospel, it will not work for everyone, and I am not going to try and sell you any BS courses or study guides or anything like that. And for the love of God, please stop falling for stuff like that. Do not buy anything from Medfluencers. I guarantee you that I scored better than what they did and better than really anyone. And even I do not feel like there's anything that I can ethically sell you that is better than what's already out there by actual companies. With that all said, let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to start out talking about my mindset towards studying. And I know, but bear with me, this is actually really important for what I'm going to say in the rest of the video. And I think it had really big implications for why I did as well as I did. So from the start of everything, I studied with the goal of preparing myself for real-world clinical practice, not just the test. On tests, you have a ton of different information already spoon-fed to you, and you have multiple choice questions to pick from, but in real life, you have none of that, right? Instead, you need to have built out a clinical reasoning framework already in your head, and you need a knowledge base that you can freely pull from and work with. Having that is how you know what differential list to work through, what questions you need to ask patients, what physical exam to do or what to look for, the test to run to differentiate diseases, and so on. This also all requires you to know things a lot better than just the multiple choice. I focused on this because I was a PT before I went back to med school, and I learned that lesson the hard way when I went out to real life, and it became clear that I didn't learn things well enough to really do it at times. You're probably sitting there right now like, okay, whatever, but the test is the test. That's all I care about right now. I don't care about your soapbox. But here is why this still actually matters for the test itself. Online, you'll see a lot of people talking about the ambiguity of the NBMEs and how vague and unclear they think they are. The thing is, the NBME tests are here to test our clinical reasoning and our clinical competency. They want to see if we are prepared for and can work through those real-life situations where we are not spoon-fed information. So, do we know all those things I just mentioned well enough for real life? Now, instead, if you do what most people do, and you just go and memorize the classic vignettes, and this applies especially if you're studying from flashcards and resources made that are based upon the presentation of those classic vignettes in the Qbanks, then you are just training yourself to recognize that situation or disease in that specific context, and you get trained to treat it as an A plus B equals C situation. And if that is what you're looking for, then when you get thrown a situation that doesn't quite fit that archetype, you'll find yourself struggling a bit because you have not built the framework or the understanding necessary to be able to reason through that question. And a ton of the NBME stuff is ambiguous like this because, in my opinion, it wants to see if you can reason through those unclear, gray, or more real-life situations. So that was a really long way to say that one of my biggest tips is to try and study with that goal in mind. It will help you in the tests, but also, frankly, more importantly, in real life and rotations. As we go through the rest of the video, I will explain how this influenced and how I applied it to the way I study. With that out of the way, let's talk about study resources. I'm going to run through Qbanks, videos, podcasts, and textbooks. For question banks, I focused on three main sources. Number one is UWorld. This is your gold standard for building the foundation you need. Number two was Amboss. Now, Amboss had some information that I didn't come across on UWorld, but it also often went down a very large rabbit hole of minutia that realistically were things that are never going to be tested on the real exams. However, the one thing I would definitely recommend from Amboss is their quality and safety section and their ethics section. Read the articles, do the practice questions, because I thought it was more useful and applicable to the real exams than UWorld was. And number 3, the most important one here, is the NBME exams. I truly cannot stress this enough. Prioritize these above and beyond everything else and really go and pick them apart. This legitimately might be the biggest thing I did differently than most people that got me the score I did. It remains insane to me that so many people skip these in favor of UWorld or AMBOSS. You should 100% be doing the complete opposite of that. The practice NBMEs are written by the same people who write the real step and shelf exams. UWorld is not. Now, when I say NBMEs, by the way, I mean the practice step 2 exams as well as the practice shelf exams. This includes both the ones you can buy online right now, but also the old retired ones that you can find floating around the internet if you look. I very strongly recommend going through these exams and looking very closely at how the writers phrase things, how they describe different diagnoses, at what lab values they expect you to have memorized right off the bat. I would also look at what they typically put for answer choices, at the tricks they try to play, at what diagnoses or situations they tend to test, at what images they tend to use to show something, and so on and so on. If you do this, what you'll notice really pretty fast is that all of the things I just mentioned get repeated again and again across the exams. If you do all of the OB exams in a row or all of the Step 2 ones in a row, you'll notice that they keep testing the same small number of diagnoses in very slightly different ways. You'll also notice that the descriptive terms they use for different answer choices keep on repeating themselves. And you'll notice they expect you to have things like the T4 value memorized and so on. And big shocker, the same exact things repeat on the real Step 2 and on the real shelf exams. If instead you only use UWorld, you end up training yourself by how UWorld tests, by how they phrase, how they try to trick you, and so on. But this is a very different thing from how the NBME does it. And if you walk in expecting UWorld, you're going to have a harder time than you need to. Now let's speed up a little bit and talk about the video resources. First, online med ed. Honestly, I didn't really find this very helpful for Step 2. It's too basic, it's incomplete, it's out of date, so on. Second is Boards and Beyond. I did actually find this helpful overall, especially for getting a foundation in OB and PEDS, so that new Step 2 content. But honestly, I mostly just liked it because I like passive videos to listen to when I'm kind of mentally drained and just want that for spaced repetition. Number 3 is Osmosis Clinical Reasoning. This is a wild card you probably have not heard of. I hadn't either, but I actually ended up really liking these. The Osmosis videos were arguably the most relevant ones for Step 2, and especially for things like the psychiatry section, but others too, where I saw stuff on them that I never saw elsewhere, but I actually did get real test questions on the NBMEs about. Next up is Emma Holiday. I thought this was reasonably helpful for passive listening, especially in PEDS and internal medicine. But outside of that, it was often kind of outdated, and so I wouldn't rely very hard on them. Definitely not on the psych or the OB ones. And then our last one is Dr. High Yield stuff on YouTube. I listened to these a decent amount when I was walking or working out, and he did net me a question on gout, but overall, while I didn't think these were bad, I do remember he was wrong on a couple of things as well. So it's not a vital resource. On the whole, I thought it was helpful, and there were a couple nuggets here, but you have to be mindful. Next, let's talk about podcasts. The only one I did was I listened to Divine Intervention while driving, working out, cleaning, so on. I know people have mixed feelings on him, but he definitely got me some points here and there, so I thought there was a lot of value to them. The biggest one being that it just made it really easy to keep having that spaced repetition because you could kind of briefly refresh on a lot of things pretty easy. As for textbooks, the only one I used was White Coat Companion, which is the Boards and Beyond book. I thought this was really helpful for a succinct review to quickly skim. It was basically like first aid for Step 1. And it did also contain some info like that psych material that I didn't see elsewhere. I glanced really briefly at first aid for Step 2 and decided it was not worth my time. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about Anki. This is a really big one. I personally did not use the pre-built Anki decks. This could be a really long tangent, but the crux first here is that I do not think they are very good for step 2. The cards themselves can spoil the practice questions and the Qbanks because that's what they're made from, giving you a false impression of how well you're doing. They also focus on fact regurgitation or that A plus B equals C situation, which is great and all for step 1, not so much for step 2, where you need to have actual clinical reasoning, like I've already said. With that said, I did actually do quite a lot of Anki, but I did Anki with my own cards that I made based upon the Qbanks. And these were a lot more clinically focused and info-dense, because they were basically my way of taking notes, which leads us into how exactly did I study from the Qbanks. As I went through the question banks, I focused on learning what it was that I needed to know for real life, and so I made cards to try and help me out with that. Every time I saw a diagnosis that was new to me, or UWorld had a chart, I deemed that was important to know, and so it got its own card. Here's examples of how I made my cards. So first, let's say I wanted to make a card focused on how to handle a specific situation. Then the front of the card would be something like, you have a patient with X, Y, whatever symptoms, and X labs. Number 1, what is your differential diagnosis here? Number 2, what are the next steps you should take to differentiate them? And number 3, what would you do in each different situation? Alternatively, if I wanted to focus on learning how to identify or manage a specific diagnosis rather than a situation, it would be things like, first, what is the classic age demographic situation for X diagnosis? 2, what labs would you expect to see? 3, what things or tests do you need to do to differentiate it from other differentials? And then how would you manage the condition or situation, as well as what might change how you manage the condition. As I went to make these, I would also try to mentally justify why each step or test made sense. This helped me remember things, but also link together concepts and build that reasoning framework. Naturally, on the back of these cards would be an egregious amount of information that's overwhelming for most people. But what it did is it trained me to be able to freely recall all of this as I would need to in real life. And it also set me up to approach questions trying to do the same and knowing what I'm trying to look for, how I'd work it up, and so on. This contrasts again really heavily to memorizing facts or cards from pre-built decks, where you end up relying on getting some little piece of info as a trigger, and you end up kind of breaking down when you don't have that little trigger for that recall. And when I went back to study from these questions, I would try to answer all of those questions I laid out, and when I drew a blank, I would flip the card around and then look at where I went wrong. So that was how I generally studied from Anki, and I could go on for a while, but I think you get the idea. Next, let's talk about some other random tips I had for studying from the question banks. Number 1, I recommend reading every single thing in UWorld. I know a lot of people will just go and read the learning objectives at the bottom, but if you do that, you miss out on a ton of information. A lot of the info you find in the paragraphs above explaining things is also important to both understand the reasoning for why things are the way they are, and also often ends up being material tested on the real exam. Number 2 is to realize that you won't take it all in the first time you see it. Maybe you're just a lot smarter than me because, hey, my memory's not great. But for me personally, I usually would go highlight, save, and turn the info into a card. And a lot of that was because I typically had to see things a few different times to make it stick or begin to start making connections. And because I saved so much info, I would often come back, skim, and pick up new key points from those explanatory paragraphs the next several times I saw it too. Number 3 is specific to the NBMEs, but I would ensure that you understand what every alternative answer choice is getting at and be able to explain why it is incorrect. I would not recommend doing this for UWorld though, as it's kind of a waste of time there because again, tests are different. The reason is, like I said before, the NBME tends to recycle things, including those alternative answers and phrases. So you want to try and make sure you know what they all are, so you know what you're looking at when it comes up on the real test. Also, by going and looking at these, it shows you what they are likely to try and contrast the concept being tested in the question with again in the future when you encounter it on different future tests. And one last thing on it is there were also diagnoses I got real questions on the real exams, but I only ever saw as an alternative answer choice on the NBMEs. Had I not looked and read, I wouldn't have known what they were. The fourth miscellaneous thing is when you're doing UWorld to really go and dissect out the charts they make. Typically, there is a lot of important information that is dense in those charts, but doesn't get tested again directly in the question, yet often shows up both clinically and on real exams. With that said, it is a little tricky at times because there are some that just seem like unnecessary fluff. For example, there's this amiodarone thyroid chart I remember seeing a lot that was kind of a waste of time. But overall, I stand by the statement. And the final thing for this video right now is some quick miscellaneous recommendations I have. Number 2, on biostats, focus on learning the concepts. By that, what I mean is try to understand from a practical standpoint what things like sensitivity, specificity, or likelihood ratios tell you about clinical medicine, not just how to calculate them. Essentially, all of the step 2 biostats questions I got were word games testing your understanding of this. None of them were plug and chug equations like people are used to. Number 3 is to memorize the NBME lab values. I mean the CMP, CBC type values, but also the random things that you'll notice they test a lot as you go through their exams. This is things like T4 level or IQ that you don't really think about, but they also don't give you the normative value for in the QSTEM. This helped me to answer questions quite a lot faster, and really importantly, I stopped making dumb mistakes where I ended up overlooking a very slightly abnormal lab value because it seemed good enough, but I didn't realize it was like 0.1 or 0.2 or whatever off. Okay, so this video has become a lot so far, but I hope it's been at least somewhat valuable to you. And to prevent it from being too long and overwhelming, as I said, I'm going to make a second video walking you through how I approach the NBME practice questions and how to think about them. So if that interests you, then go ahead and subscribe to keep an eye out for it. Otherwise, thanks for watching, good luck with your studying, and please do not fall for the Medfluencers.